Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the selection of prints that are currently on rotation outside of Garfield Gallery. You've probably seen them as you've made your way in and out to the docent room. This particular selection of prints was chosen by James Wen in order to complement the work of Fabrice Montero. You'll note that there's a couple of objects there from our permanent collection, including a sculpture and the pounded aluminum you're probably quite familiar with. I'm going to focus mostly on the prints today because I feel like those are things that a lot of us haven't seen in a while or had much access to, and there's some really great stories. So as I was preparing to talk to you about this work and researching some of the artists, I started to notice some overlapping themes to the work. And so on plain sight, it's pretty easy to see that some of the themes relate to content. So you'll see that, there's lots of landscape images, there's lots of imagery incorporating single figures. But more so, as I started reading the stories and learning more about this work, I found some overarching themes. And a couple of those themes relate to issues of apartheid, both pre and post-apartheid. This concept of the art center and the importance of the art center in the work of these artists. As I was reading more about this, I really started thinking about the Ancestral Modern exhibition and the importance of art centers in Aboriginal communities. Many of these artists are actually from Johannesburg, so there's a nice kind of overarching connection there. And then many of them, more interestingly so, found art very early in their childhood. And so I always think that's an interesting way to connect both to children and adults, because not everybody is born an artist, but art is something that can be nurtured and taught and developed over the years. So we're going to start with this first image here, which is a picture of the South African Prime Minister with his national party. This is the group that created the blueprint for apartheid. As you know, and we're not going to get, I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty, dirty details of apartheid, because we know there was many massacres, there was some deaths involved during protests, but I want to talk about really the foundation of apartheid as it relates to the work of these artists. So we know that apartheid is Afrikaans for apartness, and it was introduced in 1948 by the African National Party. And as you'll look at this party here, you'll see they have one overarching similarity, which is that they all have light-colored skin. The idea of apartheid was really about separate development of different racial groups, essentially keeping the non-whites from the whites, to put it in simple terms. During apartheid, there was many things that happened, including the fact that South Africans who were non-white were forced to live separately from whites. They were forced to use different public facilities. This forced separation created a really inequitable system. It was dangerous, actually, during apartheid to befriend somebody of an opposite racial group. In fact, doing so would bring suspicion on you. And apartheid, severely disadvantaged the majority of the population. So, when we think of apartheid, we can actually think it really closely connected to our American history in terms of slavery and segregation. So here are some images of signage that would have been commonplace at the time of the rise of apartheid in 1948. So you see some of the language on here, and a lot of this language is really about danger, caution, because you could have fines, you could be punished, or as it says at the top left side, natives, Indians, and colors, if you enter these premises at night, you will be listed as missing. Armed guards shoot on sight. Savage dogs devour the corpse. You have been warned. So this idea that not only were you to stay away from these areas, but there would be severe consequences if you crossed these lines. There were several things that actually happened, several kind of acts that were enforced during segregation, and I want to go to this next slide because I think it's telling. So what this slide shows is actually a young woman holding a pass book. And a pass book was something that every person of color had in South Africa at this time. In fact, they were required, and what this pass book did was prohibited black people essentially from entering urban areas without immediately finding a job. This is part of a couple of acts or legislation that came from apartheid. One was the Group Areas Act of 1950, which said that there will be physical separation between races, especially in urban areas. And as we know, this resulted in some real forcible removal of groups of people into townships. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act in 1959 said that different racial groups had to live in different areas, and essentially this was touted as a way of cleaning up the white areas by removing quote-unquote black spots inside of them. So this basically said that people of color could only live in townships outside of town. They could not own property, they could only rent it, and that's because land at that time was only to be white owned. So what happened here is you have these exoduses of people who are moving to these underdeveloped areas and in turn entering the poverty cycle because segregation, because apartheid was structured in such a way as to really promote inequity in this way. And so you can see here, you know, this pass book is something that you would have had on your person at all times to really remind you of where you stand, where you're allowed to go, where you're permitted to be. And so this is something where these folks would use these to go back and forth between non-white and colored or black areas. And I'm using the language colored and black because that's the way it was used at the time. So what we're looking at here, as we know, apartheid has a long legacy, and the figure on the right should not be news to you. That's Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela made history for a lot of reasons. One, he was the first black president of South Africa, but also he's the one who really put an end to apartheid in terms of legislatively. So in 1994, when he was elected president, he adopted a new constitution that said South Africa would no longer be ruled by racial discrimination. However, as we know, 2019 marks 25 years post-apartheid, and while legal separation and segregation may not be enforced, the effects are lasting. So if you look at the two images on the left, the upper left image reflects a township scene in 1948. So you can see here, we can tell just from the style of the building alone, this is absolute poverty. We have a person, a young mother, it looks like, who's hanging clothes on the line as her children watch on. The image directly below is a township scene in 2019. So while we can say that apartheid's over and progress has been made, in fact, the legacy and the effects of apartheid are so far lasting that these communities are still trying to recover. And if you're following any of the current political climate in South Africa right now, you know that the African National Congress, which is the party that Nelson Mandela started, are really trying to do some work in order to move beyond these legacies of poverty. And I want to make a correction. Actually, earlier, the last slide, I said that Nelson Mandela founded the African National Congress, which is not true. It's been around since 1912. It was actually the party that he was affiliated with and the party that helped overturn apartheid. So this image here I wanted to share with you because, again, it's another really stunning example of the legacy of apartheid 25 years later. So Johnny Miller is actually a photographer based here in the United States, And in 2019, he did a drone photography series where you can see here he's captured aerial photographs of certain parts of South Africa. This image happens to be from Johannesburg, and if you look at it, I think it's a really clear and telling illustration via photograph of the lasting impact. So we can see here, just even if we're thinking about color very literally, there is no color on the right side of this, right? It is brown, dirt, destitute. We notice that these homes don't have backyards. They're literally stacked on top of each other. This is absolute destitute poverty. And you know, these are the townships that many of the artists on view here today grew up in and have first-hand experience with. I just think that you know, there's still much work to be done, and not sure where that's headed, but again, I just think this is a really kind of stark example, and I like to share it, as you can see. Okay, so this is artwork by an artist, Ezra Ligay, and I'm going to just preface all of these by saying that I absolutely expect to pronounce names wrong, and I apologize. It's really hard to find pronunciations. So this image is actually titled Dakar, and you know, I mentioned that James selected these works because of their kind of complementary nature to Fabrice Montero. And when I look at this, I immediately think of the photograph of Fabrice with the cattle and the cattle farmers. Ezra Ligay was born in Johannesburg, like many of the artists that we're about to see here. He studied at the Poly Street Art Center, which is actually very notorious in that it became a place where it was the first professional cohort of African artists whose art was concerned with the social conditions of segregation in these settlements. So you'll see that much of this work, while maybe not necessarily overtly political in terms of we think about somebody like Warrington Colescott, is political in that they're responding to the events that are happening around them. I want to share this quote by Ligay because it's very telling about the work he makes. So when you look at his work, you'll see that a lot of his work is visual commentary on the social conditions of apartheid. And this is a critique that he has extended, or did extend, up until he passed away. And so he wasn't just critiquing apartheid at the rise, but he continued to critique the existence of poverty and racism in post-apartheid years. You'll notice in his work, he often uses animals, and sometimes these animals are references to animals that you might see in the African landscape. They're also animals that might be popular in African folklores, and he uses the animals sometimes as stand-ins for people. And so when you see animals being mistreated, he's using them really to represent the way that we mistreat humans. This image in particular has just stuck with me. It's called Ancestor, and one thing that really intrigues me about Ezram's work is this use of kind of hatching drawings, so all of this scribble gesturing, which to me adds a really eerie kind of emotional undertone. Ezra, so again here we look at another work where he's got some animals. So you see an owl. This piece is called Thinking Freedom. And so, you know, to me, having an owl here makes sense in terms of we associate owls with wisdom. The image in the middle, I'm not sure what kind of bird that is. I see a crow. And then, you know, on the left, I'm not sure exactly what's happening here, but I can't help but think of a noose and a hangman because of that kind of structure. But Ezra, I wanted to read a quote from him This is actually from an interview he did that happened around in 1993. So this was about a year prior to Nelson Mandela coming into office. He said, "I will continue to talk about things as I see them. People can change, but masters cannot. Change doesn't happen overnight." I think that that quote is very telling of the kind of work that's on view here today, and also very telling of some of the themes and the reasons for why Fabrice Montero made the series that he did. So this idea that people can change but masters cannot is quite interesting when you think about who are the people, who are the masters. And in broader terms, how does this concept of people and master play out in other parts of our society? This next artist is an artist, Hargreaves Nutkwama. I'm saying that wrong. I apologize. Another artist from Johannesburg. He actually attended school for art, so you'll find out that many of these artists had either informal or formal schooling in art to some extent. Hargreaves, in this example, actually disappointed his father when he rejected schooling in medicine to study art. So, in fact, he had to pay for that tuition himself, and he did so by working as a clerk and a messenger to pay for schooling. Hargreaves is actually interesting because the image on the right is what he became to be known for with his work, but he got his start actually from this album cover on the left. So this is an album cover for an album called Dollar Brand Underground in Africa, and this is really what put him kind of on the main scene. One of the things that you'll notice about his work, and I'm going to move to the next slide here, it's more visible here, is that the checklist says that he works in ink and watercolor, and I'm actually not sure how accurate that is. I would have to do some more research. One of his favorite techniques actually was to blow diluted oil paper onto water and then wipe away the excess with cloth or cotton balls. And if you look at this, you can really see that smudging in the background. So these reds and this sweeping motion off to the sides is all from him wiping that oil paint away. And what he would do then is draw over the top of these images with ink. So he really was letting the, if we think about this, I almost think about automatic drawing with the surrealists, but this idea of kind of letting the color dictate the shapes rather than coloring in the shapes, if that makes sense. Another interesting element of this piece to me, and you'll see this again in most of these, is again that reference to a township. So we can almost assume that that architectural structure in the middle is perhaps meant to reference a township scene. Again, as I mentioned, many of these artists grew up in these townships. They worked in these townships. These were their home. So this is firsthand observation. They're not painting about things they don't know. They're actually painting about their realities. Hargreaves unfortunately passed away in 1999 from Parkinson's disease, which made it really hard for him to continue painting on later in life. This is a work by an artist, Billy Molokeng, who's also from Johannesburg. Billy was actually orphaned as a child and raised by his sister. I mention that because, having been orphaned, he had to come up with really invented ways to sustain himself. And one of the ways he did that was by selling drawings. So he sold drawings from childhood and then later paintings to make a living. He was actually fortunate in that he was able to attend private school, and that's because he eventually found the grace of a wealthy sponsor who afforded him the opportunity to go to a private school. This image, depicts musicians, which is interesting because Billy himself had a second kind of career as a musician. In fact, many of these artists, Hargreaves, whose work we just looked at, also moonlighted as a musician. For Billy, his stage name was Billy Africa, and he composed and wrote a lot of his original works. And I believe that you can still find work by him today musically. much of his early paintings depict things straight from townships, and so you'll see that in terms of what this image looks like, it's very bold. It's kind of doesn't have a lot of dimension. Some of the dimension is singular in that this is not necessarily three-dimensional fine architectural drawing. But what's interesting is, again, when we think about Fabrice Montero and overlaps, when I look at this, I immediately see the photograph by Fabrice of the woman wearing the gas mask that talks directly about pollution. You see these figures that are sitting in a car. We can understand that the car is broke down because when we look at it close up, the circular shapes suggest that those are tires. There's doors missing. All of these figures are kind of shoved into this vehicle. We can notice that the roof appears to be kind of cracked in. In the background, we see some images or evidence of a township. So we see these homes that, that's not brickwork. It's very fractured and jagged, suggesting, again, a reference to kind of some of the dilapidated environment. But what I think is really interesting about this is that, to me, these townships, were absolute destitute poverty. But I see hope in these images, in particular this one. I see the faces as being almost a little mysterious, mischievous maybe, kind of happy. Billy was known for the lighthearted approach which he would take to his work. And, and even though this is not moving, right, because it's a still image, I see a lot of life happening in this piece, which I think is quite interesting. So yeah, one thing I want to point out, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this sooner, but I keep referring to townships. And that brings us to a larger point about township art. So a lot of this work would fall in that genre, that category. And township art was actually coined in the 1960s, and it really references the movement that came out of the 60s by the art being made by Black artists that was really blossoming in these communities. This was township art, was basically easily identified by its subject matter and its source. The artists involved were all mostly residents of Black communities, these Black townships outside on the outskirts of Johannesburg. They were not only artists, many of them were teachers and students at some point. Many of them had been students at some time at the Polly Street Art Center. Township art is really known for its subject matter, which is everyday life of the community in which these artists live. It was essentially concerned with the human condition. And part of this was, I think, a way to kind of make some sense or make something meaningful or beautiful out of the destruction, the separation, the forced removal, all of the really terrible things that were happening at the time. If you were to Google township art, you'll see lots of other work that kind of looks this way. And a couple of other kind of really identifying factors is that township art often will have a single figure or a set of figures. There's some really interesting stylization happening here that I think you can see perhaps across some of this work. One thing you'll notice too is that township artists were often very thrifty in that they used materials that were readily evident and available to them. So things that did not cost a lot, like charcoal or graphite paper. This isn't oil paint. This isn't bronze, right? So really using materials kind of from the earth readily at hand, which again is why it makes me think of some overlaps with the artist communities that we formerly talked about when looking at the Ancestral Modern exhibition. Okay, enough of my rambling, moving on. Okay, so the image on the right here is actually included in this rotation. The image on the left is not, but it has a connection. So the image on the right is by an artist, Gabasili Nkosi, who actually, unfortunately, had a very short life, and I will come back to that later. But This print and the following print were part of a portfolio called Cross-Cultural Identities. And this was a print exchange that was created between South Africa and North America. And one of the people who actually founded and developed this was John Hitchcock, who is beloved faculty in the art department today. The artists who were part of this portfolio were chosen for a number of reasons, and largely for the fact that they all made work that explored issues related to the land, investigated issues of identity, and commented on different historical perspectives. So really, this work is talking about how landscape and culture can shape a person's artistic viewpoint. Both of these countries have really complicated relationships with colonization, as we know from our own history and as we learn from some of these other histories. And the print medium, as we also know, has a long history of being used for commentary on social and political issues. So it just seemed like the perfect medium to deliver the message. In total, 16 artists were part of this portfolio. And the two that are included on view in this rotation are Gabasile Nkosi on the right and Tando Mama, who we'll look at next. So I tried to translate the title of this print with some success, and what I found was that the word Izindiza is Zulu for fleets, flippers, aircraft, and the word machini is Zulu for mechanism. And so you know, I don't know how accurate that is, but when I read aircraft, fleeting, and mechanism, I started to think, okay, well, that might make sense based on the visual clues I have here. So Nkosi, I'm sorry, was actually, she had a very short career. Her life was ended short, very tragically, but during that time, she made a huge impact and left a legacy on the print world. She was well known as a mother first, an activist, humanitarian, and printmaker second, third, fourth. She was really interested in the therapeutic benefits of art making, and this was something that not only therapeutic for her, but she used this as a way to enrich the lives of others. So she would often teach workshops to women who were past victims of domestic violence as a way to show them how art can enrich and augment their lives. She was associated with many humanitarian efforts and made a lot of work addressing the HIV/AIDS crisis, as well as being a staunch advocate of women's rights. Unfortunately, at the age of 34, she was tragically murdered by a former ex-boyfriend who broke into her home, killed himself after killing her, and did so in front of her 13-year-old son. Flash forward years later, her son is actually now a student in printmaking and is working really hard to make sure his mother's legacy gives on and using his own art to fulfill her mission. When I look at this piece in particular, I immediately see the Kara Walker work, African American, and I'm really struck, I think, by some of the same ideas. So the more I look at this, I really am focused on this figure in the middle, and I have many questions. So I think about, is this figure falling from the bird? Are they trying to grasp the bird? Do they want to are they trying to hitch a ride on this bird to go somewhere else? Are they running away from something? Is the figure male or female? It's hard to tell. The figure appears to have short hair and wearing tattered rags, but we know nowadays, and also thinking about certain cultures, hair and dress are not always indicative of gender. I'm also very interested in kind of the township scene below. And so I think about something Fabrice said when he was here, in that he said he thinks of all of his photographs as questions. And I think this is also a nice example of that, because for me, there's more questions that I ask than answers. You know, there's something really interesting happening in the rotations of the birds in the background. They actually are not flying, they're flying in a way to me that suggests there's some kind of chaos or perhaps impending danger. Yeah, that's my interpretation. You, I'm sure, will have many wonderful conversations with visitors to determine others. This is another print from that series, but it's by a different artist named Tando Mama. And Tando is also a South African artist who's working mostly in Cape Town. He actually is fairly young, so he is in his 40s, still has a very prolific career, currently working on an MFA at Rhodes University. He actually works a lot in video, but and he works with a lot of different themes, but one of the things that he's really interested in is Black masculinity, and he often uses his own body as a subject. I'm not clear whether this is a metaphor of his own body here, but I just wanted to point that out. So when I look at this, I have a couple of interesting observations. So when I look at the leg that's closest to us, I see these straps, which to me are confusing because I'm trying to understand, are they stockings? Is it a prosthetic? This idea of a prosthetic for me is enforced by the very articulated kneecap on the far leg. There's some really interesting stylization going on around the face, so I'm trying to understand if that person is wearing glasses, goggles, is their mouth covered? There's something that could be a scar on the arm, so is that a reference to scarification? And then there's that one hint of color, which is this red, right, that appears to be on the eyeball of this sun. I'm not sure what any or all of that means, but when we talk about, you know, the one thing that kind of connected all of the work in this portfolio is artists who are thinking about their relationship with the land and identity. I think it makes sense. And again, here's another one where is this figure running away? Are they trying to release themselves from the sun? What is the relationship between the sun and this figure? Where are they going? The hairstyle is actually interesting to me because when I see this, I almost see a lot like that really cartoony electrocuted thing that happens when you watch like a Looney Tunes cartoon, but again, I'm not quite sure what's happening here, but I think there's a lot of discussion to be had. This is an artist, David Mabile, or was an artist, David Mabile, and again, I know that I'm saying his name wrong. Here's another artist who grew up in Johannesburg. When we talk about township art, we have a really great example here. So, you know, here's an image of a man just doing an ordinary activity, reading a book. This is something that Mabile employed often. So he often has images of men just going about their everyday. One thing to me that's interesting about him was I learned that he learned how to draw by copying cartoons from newspapers. And knowing that, I think, makes a lot of sense when you look closer at this image. So if we think about newspapers, limited color palette, right? This is a device that Mabile employs often. The other thing is newspaper cartoons don't have a lot of detail. So we have some of this distortion, not a lot of detail. And in my opinion, that distortion coupled with the lack of color palette really lends an emotional aspect to this image. You know, it's hard to know if this is a self-portrait. You know, is he using this person as a stand-in for himself? But again, when we think about township art, this is a really kind of nice example of that singular image, everyday life, very stylized to the region. This last image we're going to look at is by an artist, Godfrey Ndaba, who was born in Soweto, Johannesburg, and actually lived in the township of Soweto almost all of his life. He is one of 11 children. So he came from a big family, and as a child, he was obsessed with art. I read an interview where he talked about he would often draw faces in wet soil after it rained. And later, that interest in portraiture translated from him drawing portraits in soil to making sculptures with clay that he had dug out of riverbeds. I mentioned earlier, about the role of art centers, and also this idea of how these artists were, not just practitioners, but often teachers. And this is a really nice example. Ndaba is probably regarded as one of the best South African artists, but he's also a prolific teacher. So he has his own studio in Johannesburg, and there he teaches. And I want to share with you a little bit about his philosophy at teaching, because I think it's kind of interesting. So he often tells his students to approach art as observing life and the environment around them. He encourages them to capture what they see as they see it and use their art as an outlet for emotions and frustrations. And then he tells them something really interesting, which I think speaks larger to perhaps kind of grooming them as artists, and also maybe capitalism, in that he discourages his students from selling their artwork until they are competent. Which is an interesting concept to me. I'm not sure if it's because, it's easy to take advantage of young artists. It's also easy to take advantage of artists from marginalized communities, or if it's because he's really trying to instill a professional practice. But either way, I think it's really interesting. So most of his work, you'll see these images of mother and children. I think to me, when I think about the fact that he would draw portraits in wet soil, I see some relationship between that and the way that he's applying color to this page. There's a real gestural quality to the line work here. It's also interesting to me the parts that there's an unfinished quality of this work that I think is also interesting. I'm losing my train of thought here. But I'm going to end on there because I'm losing my train of thought. So, earlier when I started, I mentioned there are some common themes. So we talk about apartheid and how issues of apartheid kind of laid the foundation for the township art movement, and really the communities with where these artists are coming from. We talked about the importance of the art center and how these artists were not working in silos, right? There's often this kind of misperception of an artist working at a studio locked away. And sure, there are artists that operate that way, but in this particular case, these artists were not working in silos. It's interesting to me that Ndaba tells his students to capture what they see as they see it. Because I think that when you look back at some of these images, that's exactly what's happening here. These artists are capturing what they see, or for those who have passed away, what they saw as they saw it. So it's almost documentary in printed or drawn form. And then this notion that what was my last theme? Oh, this connection to Fabrice Montero's work. And so I think, while Fabrice's work has very specific issues that perhaps are not a direct one-to-one with the art here, there are many overlaps. And there's some things, about the relationship to community that is important to both works. The relationship to documentary, right? So Fabrice uses the camera, where these artists are using drawings, print mediums. This idea of place, right? So how do you present place? And so for some of these artists, it's about the people in the place. If we think about the early, really kind of sketchy gestural works of Ezra Lagai, the relationship to place is a little different. So through his gestural mark making, we understand that there's some tension, right? And some of it too is just, at the end of the day, making a beautiful work of art to have some respite and to give people, you know, a reason to have something nice to look at. So I am going to post this on the docent website. I will also share the hard copy of the checklist, which will also be available in the docent room. And I will share links to some relevant articles about these artists, as well as a little bit more of biographical information. But I really encourage you to spend some time with this work. I'm really disappointed we didn't get time to do that again today. But, you know, some of this work you just really have to see in person. And I think James did a really great job of isolating a selection of artists from an underrepresented portion of the world. Thank you.